Welcome to What's for Lunch, conversations about trends and trade in food and ag and how they affect what's on your plate. This podcast brings relevant information in a unique way, relevant to food businesses, farmers, and consumers, unique in that it approaches relevant issues from a different angle. I'm Susan Burns, your lunchtime host and on-call business lawyer. Our motto is always interesting, always lively, and today is no exception to that. Joining us today is Kate Graham, an attorney in the Agriculture and Trust and Estates practice groups at the law firm of Fafinsky, Mark and Johnson. And that firm is located in the great city of New Ulm, Minnesota. Kate uses her experience working on farms to serve her clients' legal needs. She handles a variety of estate planning, farm succession planning, elder law, as well as agriculture and food law matters. Kate is a passionate advocate who enjoys getting to know her clients both personally and professionally. She builds relationships founded on trust and integrity. Kate has a JD, Juris Doctorate from William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she also has an LLM, which is an advanced legal master's degree in agriculture and food law from the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So with that, welcome, Kate.
Thank you. It's great to be on your podcast.
Yeah, so I was looking forward to talking with you. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about your background and what it was that motivated you to start working in the agriculture sector.
Sure. So I grew up in the suburbs of St. Paul, Minnesota, and really didn't have any connection to agriculture. I'm probably at least two and maybe three generations removed from anybody who ever farmed. So I didn't really discover it until I went to college, and I went to college in a small town in Minnesota where we had more of a farming community, and I had the opportunity to actually work on a farm when I was in college, and it was a really eye-opening experience to me to see really where food comes from, to see people who really make their livelihood from the land, and the really intimate connection that they have with the natural world, and so it really inspired me to have a career that is involved in food and agriculture in some way. So after college, I did a little work in an environmental organization that was working in the agriculture area, and then I decided to go to law school with the hopes of being a better and more informed advocate for people who are interested in agriculture and want to make sure that we sustain our agricultural livelihoods going forward. So that's kind of what led me to the LLM program at the University of Arkansas and to New Ulm, where I practice primarily in agriculture and estate planning.
Great. And I think that your background is not much different than I would say most of the people are very divorced from where our food supply actually comes from. We see it in the grocery stores on our tables, even ordering it online, but we're not really involved in, or thinking about how is it grown and what goes into actually getting the food to us. And so it all starts with agriculture. In some respects, everything we eat starts with that.
Right.
So
Yep.
yeah, I mean, I was thinking about even the different kinds of proteins that are made today, like plant-based and cell-cultured proteins, but they all start with, food is grown. It feeds animals, it feeds us. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's great, and it's great that you're able to have developed that passion and to pursue it. And so one of the things that you do in representing farmers and landholders in your agricultural practice is you draft leases for the lease of farmland. And I guess
Mhm.
that's a little bit, most of us are familiar with a lease in the terms of renting maybe our first apartment out of college or even after that, but in the domestic sense, or sometimes commercial leases. But what goes into an agriculture lease, farmland lease?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And I think farmland leases probably share a lot in common with the typical apartment lease. But even I think, if I think back to the first apartment lease that I ever signed, I probably didn't really even read it. So most people probably don't really think about what goes into a lease, even with the leases that they're familiar with. But when I'm counseling clients on leases or drafting a lease myself, I usually start with the basic ideas of who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so if you think about those things and really answer those questions for the lease of your farmland, if you're the landowner or if you're leasing land as a tenant farmer, if you've been able to answer all those questions and if your lease answers all those questions, you're probably in a pretty good spot. So just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on what I mean by that. So the who is the parties to the lease, which is pretty straightforward. So that's usually the landowner and then the tenant farmer. The what would be the farmland, but it could also include buildings or it might include tools or equipment, and it may also include housing, which would make it a little more similar than to a residential lease agreement. Um, and then also part of the what is what does the landowner receive in exchange for the lease of the land? So most people probably think of cash, a cash rent lease, which is probably now the most common type of lease. But traditionally, crop share leases were very popular, and that would mean that the landlord actually receives a share of the harvest from the land in exchange for leasing the land to the farmer. And then there are also other kind of more creative ways of designing what the rent looks like. So you could do a hybrid of a cash rent and a crop share lease, or you can also make the rent payments fluctuate depending on changes in that crop year's either market prices or yield. So that's a way to kind of respond to changes, on the ground. Um, so then the where, of course, would be the legal description. If, for a lot of farmland doesn't necessarily have a postal address. So a lot of times you have to actually have the legal description of the land. You might even need a survey for that. And then the when is also very important. So when does the farmer gain access to the land? When does the lease terminate? Can the lease be terminated early under certain circumstances? Or can the lease be renewed automatically under certain terms? Things like that are very important to figure out. And then the why is the purpose of the lease. And a lot of people, I think, don't really think a lot about what why means to them, but you want to think about is the purpose of this lease simply to allow the farmer to farm for any agricultural purpose? Is there going to be tourism or recreation on the farmland? Is it going to be a U-pick or will there be on-farm sales? And do you want the farmer to perform any kind of, what we might call ecosystem services or conservation on the land as well? So that can be addressed in the lease. And then the how is also very important and I think overlooked a lot of the time. And that's really what uses are allowed and what uses are not allowed on the land. And so when we talk about things like conservation, we want to make sure that the lease really covers that the farmer is going to leave the land in at least as good and maybe better condition than the way they found it. So the how can really address all that. So once you've kind of answered all those questions, you have a pretty good start at least on a lease agreement.
So that sounds all pretty straightforward. And so I'm wondering, where are the points of tension between the landowner and the farmer that's leasing the land from them? And then you mentioned some of the creative solutions for payment. But
Mhm.
what are how do you what are the tensions and how do you address those? And have you developed any kind of unique ways of doing that?
Sure. One of the things that sometimes can be uh, an issue in these negotiations can be the duration of the lease. As I said, it's becoming a lot more common to do just a straight cash lease for maybe one growing season. But the problem with that for the farmer is that if they don't know that they're going to be farming that land again the following season or maybe several years in a row, there's not very much incentive for them to really invest in conservation practices on the land that would make that land more profitable and also would protect the environment from the perspective of erosion, uh, water runoff, things like that, where you're looking at sort of the downstream effects of agriculture and the chemicals that are sometimes applied and things like that. Land tenure is a really big issue for a lot of farmers, and um, so so, but on the flip side of that, a lot of times the landlord is interested in just a lease for the season because they're thinking they're going to lock in that rent price, which is again typically a cash rent amount. They want to lock it in for this year, but for next year they might be thinking the land value is going to increase and they might want to increase the rent amount, and so they don't want to be stuck in a long-term lease where they're maybe not going to get the most money per acre that they could possibly get. So, one of the creative solutions we can use in our leases is to allow for a longer term lease or a lease that might renew automatically um, on rent terms that adjust each year. And so the adjustment could be, it might be sort of a fixed cost of living adjustment, or it could be a fixed increase based on what we are estimating the farmland values are going to increase at. Or it could also be an amount that is tied more directly to what's happening in the agricultural market. For instance, the University of Minnesota keeps statistics on farmland rental rates. And so you could actually use that data to help you figure out where your farm is relative to those average county rates. So maybe your land is worth a little bit more, maybe it's worth a little bit less. And you could say, okay, we're going to the rental agreement is going to be based off of that sort of the actual data that we're seeing on county average rental rates as a way to compensate for changes in the market. So that way the farmer can have some assurance that they're going to be on this piece of land for some time. And the landlord also has assurance that they're going to be getting the best return on investment that they can be getting. So those are some of the things that we can do to create a little bit more flexibility in a written lease.
Mm-hmm. And now as you're talking, Kate, I was wondering about the current situation with we have both adverse impacts on farmers because of the tariffs that are being imposed and
Mhm.
all of the ups and downs with an uncertainty in trade. And
Right.
then we also have late plants due to flooding. And here in Minnesota, it's late plants, but in some places in Missouri and other states, they can't even, they're like boating across their land. How
Mm-hmm.
have you been hearing or talking to people about that? And because if you, I think every time we draft a contract, whether it's a lease or whatever else, we are trying to take into account certain things. And when you use those creative approaches and say, okay, well, if will increase every year this much, but what happens when you have a situation like this year, which I think probably nobody predicted?
Hmm. Yeah, it's been really difficult, and I think the conversation around here is kind of a little bit pessimistic. Last year was not a good year either. And so, it was kind of a down farm economy last year. Then going into this year, prices are really low, especially, Minnesota, it's primarily commodity and row crop farming. So the price of corn and beans being as low as it is for most people around here is not a good thing. And so, going into the season with low prices, combined with the weather that we've been having and farm fields being completely inundated, there's still a lot of fields around southwest Minnesota where I am that are still not planted. And so people are pretty concerned. And I think from a contract drafting perspective, it's I think this situation is kind of good evidence for why it's important to build in contract terms or terms into your leases that take into account the market conditions. So to the extent that your rent payments are in proportion to market prices or yield, that I think is protective of the farmer and fair to a certain extent, I think, to the landlord as well, so that the landlord isn't getting any kind of a windfall because the lease was negotiated at a time when maybe the outlook was better. So that is, I think, an important lesson in this economy.
Hmm. One very good reason to contact Kate to help you with your lease. As you were talking, Kate, I was thinking about in a lot of contracts that we draft in for, manufacturing and other things, there's a clause called the force majeure clause, and it's an act of God clause. And it is a clause that says, if we're going to deliver this and this and this on time, and if we're not on time, we'll pay this penalty. But if there is an act of God that prevents us from doing so, we're not paying any penalties. In other words, if there's a hurricane, a strike, or something like that, that's forces beyond your control that you wouldn't be able to deliver, then
Mm-hmm.
you don't have that penalty. But in the farming situation, you're always at the whim of forces of nature. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's not a clause that would be used in agricultural leases, I'm imagining.
Yeah, it's not typically, and to the extent that farmers are able to tap into risk mitigation strategies like crop insurance, and diversifying their operations, all of that is can help sort of hedge against the possibility that they might have a total loss.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, farming is, as an industry goes, it can be very unpredictable because no one can predict the weather and it's entirely weather dependent.
Right, right. Interesting. But yeah, I never thought about that before. So in your dealing with farm leases, and I think sustainability is becoming increasingly more important in agriculture as we read more and more about the degradation of the soil and the loss of biodiversity. And how do you address that? Do most of your landowner clients have that as a concern to like maintain the value of their land as farmable land? And do
Hmm.
most people that are farming, are they thinking about that, or what is your experience with that, and then how do you deal with that in a lease?
Hmm. Yeah, it really depends. I've had clients who have inherited land quite often, and a lot of times those folks really don't have a connection to the farmland. It may be land that their parents or grandparents grew up on, but they they don't really have a relationship to it, and they may have never even visited or very seldom visited the land. And so because of that disconnect in between the landowner and the farmer, and really, kind of going back to what we were talking about, how people nowadays very rarely know where food comes from, and not very many people even know a farmer. And so they're not necessarily thinking about the land in terms of conservation. They're thinking about it as an investment that's maybe not that different than a stock commodity. And so because they're not really aware of the issues and the effect that not engaging in conservation practices has on their investment, they're often really not thinking about that. And so I do try to encourage my clients to educate themselves about their land and the uses of their land and what conservation is all about. But there aren't a whole lot of good resources out there that are aimed at those non-operator landowners, to try to educate them on what resources are available to them to help preserve the quality of their soil, to prevent runoff and erosion and things like that. But I think for people who are maybe leasing land and they have a farming background, or if you're coming at the lease agreement from the tenant side, I definitely see interest in conservation from those angles. And I also think there's a growing contingent of people who do have a real conservation-minded focus, which is great to see that. And then it's a matter, again, of educating them on what options are out there for conservation, what programs are available, whether that's through university extension or USDA, that they can really tap into to try to improve their land, for future generations. So yeah.
That's a really interesting point, because and also, like, when you think of it, if you think of owning land as like a stock investment, but even so, people that invest in companies watch how the company's performing, and if depending on if it's a huge public company, how much of a stake you have in it. But if they're smaller companies, you're generally pretty interested in how management is doing, and so, excuse me, with this, it's an education piece, like you said, because you would think that an owner would want to make sure that that the farmland could continue to perform, like if it were a share of stock, you'd want to make sure that it was able to increase in value. So that's
and I think that's a great point, because I think you can analogize conservation practices as those kind of best management practices that a corporation would have. Farming is dependent upon the quality of the soil, and so your return on your investment is really dependent on whether or not the farmer who's operating that land is taking good care of that soil. And I think the disconnect is just that people don't understand that those two things are analogous. That the soil is really the essence of what people are invested in, and it requires a certain amount of care. And a lot of people don't understand, that cover crops are important, that tillage is important, that crop rotation is important. They just, because they're so disconnected from the day-to-day of life on a farm, they just don't know about these things. And so that's where becoming educated as a landowner is really important to secure your investment.
Exactly. Yeah. So the investment, for the stockholder, they would want to see the investments in inputs that create sustainable land, and that's where that would be. But that's yeah. I like that. I like this conversation, Kate. I haven't ever really
Yeah.
had that. I haven't really ever discussed that with anybody before. And I find it interesting in the more analogies because it is an investment and for all of us we need, in my opinion, to protect our most precious resources.
Mhm.
And so, you know, as you've gone along here, Kate, I'm wondering, is there anything that's really surprised you in working on agricultural leases?
Well, I think one of the challenges, particularly when I am working with a non-operator landowner, is that there's sometimes a lot of fear or uncertainty around negotiating these terms. And I think partly that comes from not knowing what's at stake and not having enough education and background to feel like they're competent in their ability to speak with the farmer who's farming their land and to say to them, have you, are you maintaining the buffer strips? Are you using low till or no till? Things like that. They just don't have the language necessarily, or
Mm-hmm.
they don't feel confident enough
Mm-hmm.
to be able to approach that topic. And then I think tenant farmers sometimes also have a real hesitancy to approach their landlord because they may fear that if they bring up issues that might be uh, on the land, as far as if there's soil erosion evident, or if the quality of the soil is diminishing, and they want to invest in conservation practices, but they need the landlord's approval to do that, or they may want to negotiate a longer term lease so that it makes financial sense for them to make that investment. I think there's hesitancy as well from farmers to speak up, and they don't want to rock the boat necessarily, because they want to make sure that um, they don't offend the landlord, and the landlord doesn't go looking for a different tenant. So I think there's kind of this reluctance to really have that conversation. But it's an important one. And I think there's also oftentimes desire on both sides to have a more meaningful conversation about what the lease agreement is really going to look like, and who's doing what, and who's responsible for what. And are we going to be investing in the quality of the soil and protecting the soil, and who's going to be responsible for doing that. And so it's just a matter of kind of breaking the ice, I think, a little bit sometimes, and also giving people the tools to feel like they have the confidence to be able to talk about those things. So that's I think an area that a lot of us who are in this sector are kind of working on, trying to cultivate more of those difficult conversations.
And I think that that's a role of a good lawyer. I mean, to me, that's one of the essential elements is that you try to facilitate those conversations, difficult conversations, and to find a way to work with the parties on it. And although you represent one side and not both sides, it's in both parties' interest to
Mm-hmm.
accomplish the deal. So it's a matter of finding the way to approach and to keep the conversation uh,
Mm-hmm.
productive, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question for you that I ask on every podcast conversation I have, and that is how does what you do, how do the lease contents ultimately affect what's on our plates? How does it affect what's for lunch?
Well, I think the farmland leasing affects what's on our plates probably in a couple different ways, and one is that something we kind of talked about already, which is this trend towards short-term cash leasing is really discouraging farmer investments in conservation and in preserving the soil and the environmental health for future generations. And I think what that means is we'll continue losing more topsoil, having more soil and farm chemicals run off into our water supply. And that ultimately is harming human health and the health of our entire ecosystem on which our lives and our food systems directly depend. So the conservation piece, I think, as a whole, really ties directly back into what we put on our plates and our even what we pour into our water glasses as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I think too is that this trend is making it more difficult for beginning farmers to compete for leased land with farmers that are more established and have greater access to capital. And we really need people who are willing to invest in the next generation of farmers by offering longer term leases with graduated payment options and options to purchase, so that we make sure we have farmers on the land in the future to grow the food that we eat. And a lot of beginning farmers are really doing some creative and interesting things on the land, and they're growing food for people and not just commodities. And that, again, directly affects what's on your plate, because a lot of these young beginning farmers are growing really good food that we should all be eating a lot more of. So leases and the land tenure issues that are really at the heart of it, I think, are really a big part of the whole question of how do we keep people on the land, and how do we make this important generational transfer of land that's we're really on a cresting wave, I think, of, as we look at the demographic shift and the aging farm population. We're going to have to replace our retiring farmers, and that means we need to cultivate beginning farmers to take over for them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you just hit on really important issues, Kate, and I look forward to hearing more from you on that topic as you go forth and educate. And of course, we'll promote this podcast. And tell us where people can find you, Kate.
So I am at the law firm of Pafinski, Mark and Johnson. We have offices in New Ulm, where I primarily practice, and also in Eden Prairie, which is a suburb of the Twin Cities. And let's see, the best way, I guess if you go on our website, it's fmjlaw.com. My profile is there, and my contact information is all there. So email, phone, that's the best way to reach me.
So FMJF as in Frank, M as in Mary, and J as in Jane?
Yes.
fmjlaw.com?
That's right.
Okay, that's where we'll find you. Well, this has been just a pleasure talking with you, Kate. So happy to have you with us, and really appreciate your making the time to come on and talk to us about creativity and sustainability in farm leases, and issues, and how all of this affects every one of us, connecting us with agriculture and the farmers that grow our food. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I really appreciate that you're bringing these conversations to the forefront. I think it is really important. So thank you.
I couldn't agree more. But so the next one, we are going to be talking about how the agriculture products get made into food products, and people starting food businesses. And we're going to be with Sari Kimball, who started Food Business Success. That's her business. And she talks about the top 10 mistakes food businesses make and how to avoid them. So we already talked to Sari once, but we only got through half of those issues. So we're going to talk with Sari again. And so we'll continue the agriculture conversation right onto your plate. So we'll look forward to that as well. Thank you.